She fled St. Louis with nothing but shame and a satchel, answering a desperate rancher's call for a cook to feed his 5 motherless children on the unforgiving Kansas prairie. But when her dark past catches up to her just as she's found the family she never dared dream of, Clara must face a choice that could destroy the only home she's ever known. Will the woman who was hired to cook become the mother they've all been praying for? Or will the lies that brought her here tear apart the love that's made her whole? The stagecoach wheels hit every rock and hole on the dusty road to Millbrook, Kansas, making Clara Whitfield's teeth rattle like dice in a cup. She gripped her worn leather bag tighter, feeling the few coins inside jingle with each bump. The year was 1867, and this wild frontier town was her last chance at a new life. Behind her, St. Louis held nothing but trouble and broken dreams. Ahead lay a job cooking for a widowed rancher and his 5 children. If she could convince him she was worth hiring. "Millbrook!" shouted the driver, pulling hard on the reins. Clara's stomach twisted as the horses slowed to a stop. Through the dusty window, she saw a small town that looked like it had been dropped onto the prairie by accident. Wooden buildings lined a single main street, and everything was covered in a fine layer of dust that made the whole place look faded, like an old photograph left in the sun too long. Clara stepped down from the coach, her legs wobbly after the long ride. The August heat hit her like opening an oven door. Sweat already beaded on her forehead as she looked around for the general store where she was supposed to meet Mr. McKenna. The advertisement in the St. Louis newspaper had been short. Cook needed for family of 6. Must work hard and care for children. Good pay for right person. She had answered quickly before she lost her nerve. The general store sat at the end of the street, its wooden sign creaking in the hot wind. Clara walked toward it, her boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. Each step felt like walking toward either salvation or disaster. She had lied in her letter to Mr. McKenna. Not big lies, but lies just the same. She told him she was a cook, which was mostly true. She told him she was good with children, which she hoped was true. She didn't tell him why she had to leave St. Louis so quickly, which was the biggest lie of all. The bell above the store door rang as she pushed inside. The cool dimness was a relief after the blazing sun. Shelves lined the walls, filled with everything from flour sacks to horse harnesses. And there, near the back of the store, stood a tall man with work-rough hands and tired eyes. 5 children clustered around him like baby birds around their father. "Miss Whitfield." His voice was deep and careful, like a man who had learned to think before he spoke. When Clara nodded, he stepped forward. "I'm James McKenna. These are my children." The oldest was a girl who looked about 16, with blonde hair pulled back in a neat braid. She watched Clara with sharp eyes that seemed much older than her years. A boy of maybe 13 stood beside her, trying to look grown up but still young enough that his voice sometimes squeaked when he talked. Twin girls, about 10 years old, whispered to each other behind their father's back. The youngest, a little boy with dark curls, peeked out from behind his sister's skirt. "This is Margaret," James said, pointing to the oldest girl. "She's been trying to keep house since." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Since we lost their mother 2 years back. Daniel here helps with the ranch work. Lucy and Lily are the twins, you'll figure out which is which soon enough. And this little fellow is Benjamin." The little boy stepped forward and looked up at Clara with enormous brown eyes. "Are you going to be our new mama?" he asked in a voice sweet as honey. Clara's heart squeezed tight in her chest. She knelt down to his level, ignoring the dust on her dress. "I'm going to be your cook," she said gently. "I'll make you good food and help take care of you. But will you love us?" Benjamin asked, and Clara felt like someone had reached into her chest and grabbed her heart with both hands. Before she could answer, James cleared his throat. "We should head home," he said. "It's a long ride, and there's work to be done before dark." As they loaded her trunk into the wagon, Clara caught Margaret watching her with worried eyes. The girl had been carrying too much weight for too long. Clara could see it in the way her shoulders drooped and how she automatically reached for Benjamin when he wandered too close to the horses. This family was barely holding together, and they were counting on her to help fix what was broken. But what if she was just as broken as they were? The McKenna Ranch spread across the Kansas prairie like a green island in an ocean of golden grass. Clara sat beside James on the wagon seat, bouncing with every rut in the dirt road. The 5 children rode in the back, and she could hear their voices mixing with the creak of wheels and jingle of harness. After 3 hours of riding, her back ached and her dress stuck to her skin with sweat, but she couldn't take her eyes off the land around them. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. Rolling hills stretched as far as she could see, covered in grass that waved like water in the wind. Wildflowers dotted the meadows with spots of red and yellow and purple. The sky overhead was bigger than any sky she'd ever seen, so blue it almost hurt to look at. "It can be hard country," James said, his eyes on the horizon. "Winters are cold enough to freeze your breath, and summers hot enough to bake bread on a rock. But it's ours." He glanced at her sideways. "Think you can handle it?" Clara thought about the cramped rooms and smoky air of St. Louis, about the noise and crowds and the feeling of always being watched. "I think I can learn to love it," she said. The house appeared around a bend in the road like something from a dream. 2 stories of honey-colored wood with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and sides. Flower beds that had once been neat were now overgrown with weeds, and the vegetable garden looked like it had been fighting a losing battle against the prairie grass. But the bones of the place were strong and welcoming. "Mama planted those flowers," Benjamin said, climbing over the wagon seat to squeeze between Clara and his father. "Margaret tries to take care of them, but they keep dying." "Plants need different care at different times," Clara said, looking at the struggling garden. "Maybe we can figure out what they need." The children tumbled out of the wagon like water spilling from a bucket. Daniel immediately went to unhitch the horses, moving with the careful confidence of a boy who had learned grown-up jobs too young. The twins ran toward the house, their voices bright with excitement. Margaret helped Benjamin down from the wagon, then reached for Clara's bag. "I can carry it," Clara said, but Margaret shook her head. "You're a guest," the girl said firmly. "Mama always said guests shouldn't carry their own bags." The inside of the house told the story of a family trying their best but slowly losing the fight. The front room was neat but dusty, with flowers in a vase that had died weeks ago. Children's shoes were scattered by the door, and someone had left a book open on the table beside a cold cup of coffee. It was the home of people who were too busy surviving to worry about the small details that made a house feel cared for. "Kitchen's through here," James said, leading her down a short hallway. "Margaret's been doing the cooking, but—" He pushed open a door and stopped talking. The kitchen looked like a tornado had blown through it and decided to stay for supper. Flour coated every surface like snow. Dirty dishes were stacked so high Clara worried they might fall over. Something black and crusty stuck to the bottom of a pot on the stove, and she was pretty sure it had once been beans. Or maybe beef. It was hard to tell. Margaret's face turned bright red. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I tried to clean up before we left, but Benjamin spilled the flour, and then the twins were helping with breakfast, and the bread burned, and—" Her voice got smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. Clara looked around the disaster and felt something unexpected bubble up in her chest. Not anger or frustration, but a strange kind of relief. This wasn't a test she could fail because it was already broken. All she had to do was make it better, one step at a time. "Well," she said, rolling up her sleeves, "I guess we know where to start." For the next 4 hours, Clara worked like a woman possessed. She sent Daniel to the well for fresh water and put Margaret in charge of washing dishes. The twins she set to work sorting through the pantry, making piles of what was good and what needed to be thrown away. Even little Benjamin helped, standing on a chair to stir a pot of soup that was slowly becoming something that actually smelled like food. As the sun began to set, the kitchen transformed. Clean dishes sparkled on the shelves. The floor had been swept and scrubbed until it gleamed. The smell of fresh bread and vegetable soup filled the air, along with something else. The sound of a family working together instead of just trying to survive. When James came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway and stared. His 5 children sat around the clean table, their faces washed and their hair combed. Plates and bowls waited at each place, along with cloth napkins that someone had found and pressed smooth. Clara stood by the stove, ladling soup into a serving bowl, looking like she had always belonged in this kitchen. "Supper's ready," she said simply. As the family gathered around the table, Clara started to move toward the kitchen, but James caught her arm gently. "Where are you going?" "I thought, I'm just the cook. Your family now," he said quietly, and Clara felt something deep inside her chest crack open like an egg. Family eats together. She took the empty chair beside Benjamin, and the little boy immediately climbed into her lap like he belonged there. Around the table, 5 faces looked at her with something she hadn't seen in a very long time: hope. And for the first time since she'd fled St. Louis in shame and fear, Clara Whitfield began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had found her way home. But even as she smiled at the children's chatter and felt James's grateful eyes on her face, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered a warning. Good things didn't last for people like her. And sooner or later, the past had a way of catching up, no matter how far you ran. Benjamin screamed so loud that Clara dropped the mixing bowl, sending flour flying across the kitchen like a small blizzard. She ran toward the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs as she burst through the back door. The little boy stood in the middle of the yard, blood streaming down his leg from a deep gash just above his knee. A rusty piece of metal from an old plow stuck up from the ground beside him like a metal tooth, its edge dark with his blood. "Papa!" Margaret's voice cracked as she ran from the vegetable garden, her face white as fresh snow. "Papa! Come quick!" Clara reached Benjamin first, scooping him up in her arms despite the blood soaking through her apron. His small body shook with sobs as he buried his face against her shoulder. "It hurts," he whimpered. "It hurts so bad." "I know, sweetheart," Clara said, her voice steady even though her hands trembled. "We're going to fix it." She carried him toward the house, calling over her shoulder, "Margaret, get me clean rags and the hottest water you can find. Daniel, ride fast to town and bring back Dr. Morrison." James appeared around the corner of the barn at a dead run, his face going gray when he saw the blood. "What happened?" "He was chasing the chickens and tripped," Margaret said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That old plow piece was hidden in the tall grass. I should have seen it. I should have been watching him better." "This isn't your fault," Clara said firmly as she carried Benjamin into the kitchen. She laid him gently on the table, pushing aside the bread dough she'd been working on. The cut was deep but clean, and thankfully it had missed the big blood vessels. Still, it needed careful tending to heal properly and avoid infection. For the next hour, Clara worked with steady hands while James held his son and whispered comfort in his ear. She cleaned the wound with hot water and soap, ignoring Benjamin's cries. Margaret helped by holding clean rags and keeping the twins calm when they started to cry at their brother's pain. When Dr. Morrison finally arrived, dusty from his hard ride, he examined Clara's work and nodded with approval. "You did good," he told her quietly. "Cleaned it proper and stopped the bleeding. He'll have a scar, but he'll be fine." He stitched the wound closed with quick, sure movements while James held Benjamin still. "Keep it clean and dry for a week. Change the bandage every day." After the doctor left, Clara sat beside Benjamin's bed, reading him stories until his eyelids grew heavy. The little boy's hand found hers under the quilt. "You saved me," he whispered sleepily. "That's what families do," Clara said, smoothing his dark curls away from his forehead. "We take care of each other." When she finally came downstairs, she found James sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. He looked up when she entered, and she saw fear and gratitude fighting in his tired eyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Clara poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across from him. "Margaret would have handled it. She's stronger than she knows." "She's 16, James said. "She shouldn't have to handle things like this. None of them should." He was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee cup. Their mother was the one who knew about doctoring. She could set a broken bone or treat a fever. "I'm just a rancher. I know horses and cattle, not." He gestured helplessly toward the stairs. You don't have to know everything, Clara said gently. That's why there are two parents. The words hung in the air between them, and Clara felt her cheeks grow warm. She hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to suggest anything about their arrangement beyond cooking and housekeeping. But looking at James's face, she saw that he understood exactly what she meant. Is that what you are? He asked quietly. A parent to them? Clara thought about Benjamin's small hand in hers, about Margaret's grateful smile, about the way the twins had started coming to her with their small troubles and big dreams. I don't know what I am yet, she said honestly. But I know I care about them. All of them. They care about you too, James said. Margaret told me yesterday that she feels like she can breathe again, knowing you're here to help. And Benjamin. He smiled despite his worry. Benjamin thinks you hung the moon. Later that night, Clara checked on Benjamin one more time before going to her own room. The little boy was sleeping peacefully, his breathing even and calm. Margaret sat in the chair beside his bed, a book open in her lap but her eyes fixed on her brother's face. You should get some sleep, Clara whispered. I keep thinking about what could have happened, Margaret said, not taking her eyes off Benjamin. If you hadn't been here, if you hadn't known what to do. But I was here, Clara said, settling into the chair beside her. And now he's going to be fine. They sat together in comfortable silence, two women watching over a sleeping child. Outside, the prairie wind whispered through the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called to its mate. The house creaked and settled around them, full of the quiet sounds of a family at rest. I'm glad Papa hired you, Margaret said suddenly. Not just because you can cook or clean or doctor a wound, but because you make us feel like a real family again. Clara's throat tightened with emotion. You were always a real family. You just needed a little help remembering how to be one. But even as she spoke the words, Clara felt a shadow cross her heart. She was growing to love this family more each day, but love made you vulnerable. Love gave you something to lose. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that happiness this perfect couldn't last forever. Good things had a way of being taken away from people like her, and the closer she got to this family, the more it would hurt when that day came. The morning air bit sharp and cold as Clara stepped onto the porch, her breath making little white clouds in the October chill. 6 weeks had passed since Benjamin's accident, and the scar on his leg was healing into a thin pink line that he showed off proudly to anyone who would look. The prairie grass had turned golden, and the cottonwood trees along the creek blazed yellow and orange like candles against the gray sky. Clara pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the chicken coop, her feet crunching through the frost-covered grass. This had become her favorite time of day, the quiet hour before the family woke, when she could gather eggs and plan the day's meals in peaceful silence. But this morning something felt different. The chickens were agitated, clucking and flapping in their pen instead of roosting calmly. What's wrong with you ladies? She murmured, unlatching the gate. That's when she saw him. A man crouched behind the feed shed, his clothes dirty and his eyes wild with hunger or desperation. He held one of her best-laying hens under his arm, and a canvas sack at his feet bulged with stolen eggs. Don't scream, he said, rising slowly to his feet. He was young, maybe 20, with hollow cheeks and hands that shook slightly. I don't want to hurt nobody. I'm just hungry. Clara's heart hammered, but she kept her voice calm. Put the hen down and we'll talk. Can't do that, ma'am. I ain't eaten in 3 days. His voice cracked like a boy's, and Clara saw the desperation in his eyes. I'll leave you the rest, but I need this one. What's your name? Clara asked, taking a small step closer. Tommy, he said, then seemed surprised that he'd answered. Tommy Walker. Well, Tommy Walker, stealing my chickens is a good way to get yourself shot. My employer keeps a shotgun by the door, and he's not afraid to use it. She paused, letting that sink in. But sitting at my breakfast table is a good way to get yourself fed. Which would you prefer? Tommy's face scrunched up with confusion. What? I'm making pancakes and bacon this morning. Probably more food than you could eat in a week. All you have to do is put down my hen and come inside like a civilized person." For a long moment, they stared at each other across the chicken yard. Clara could see the war in his face, hunger fighting with suspicion, hope battling with fear. Finally, he set the hen down gently and stepped back. "Why would you feed me?" he asked. "You don't know me." "Because everyone deserves breakfast," Clara said simply. "And because I've been hungry before. I know what it does to a person." 20 minutes later, Tommy sat at the McKenna kitchen table with tears streaming down his dirty face as he wolfed down his third helping of pancakes. The children watched him with wide eyes, but James had taken Clara's lead and treated their unexpected guest with quiet kindness. "Where are you headed, son?" James asked, refilling Tommy's coffee cup. "California," Tommy said between bites. "Got family there, maybe. Haven't seen them since the war, but—" he shrugged. "Got nowhere else to go." "War's been over 2 years, Daniel said. "Where you been since then?" Tommy's face went dark. "Here and there, trying to find work, mostly. But folks don't much want to hire a Confederate soldier, even one who was just a drummer boy." Clara felt her heart squeeze. This boy was barely older than Margaret, and she could see the weight of too much hardship in his young face. "How old were you when you joined up?" 14, Tommy said quietly. "Lied about my age. Thought it would be an adventure." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Some adventure." James leaned forward. "I could use an extra hand for a few days. Got fences to mend before winter, and the work's getting ahead of me. Pays not much, but it includes meals and a place in the barn." Tommy's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. "You'd trust me? After you caught me stealing?" "Man who admits when he's wrong and accepts help when it's offered. That's the kind of man I can trust," James said. "Besides, Clara vouched for you, and I've learned to trust her judgment." For the next 3 days, Tommy worked harder than anyone Clara had ever seen. He mended fences with Daniel, helped Margaret with the heavier housework, and even taught the twins a silly song he'd learned during the war. But it was with Benjamin that he formed the strongest bond. The little boy followed Tommy around like a devoted puppy, fascinated by stories of far-off places and different ways of life. On Tommy's last evening, Clara found him sitting on the porch steps with Benjamin in his lap, both of them looking up at the stars scattered across the black sky. "I wish you could stay forever," Benjamin said sleepily. "Can't do that, little man," Tommy said gently. "I got places to go and things to figure out. But I'll never forget you or your family. You saved my life, you know that?" "Miss Clara saved your life," Benjamin corrected. "She's good at saving people." Later, after Benjamin was tucked into bed, Clara walked Tommy to the barn where he'd been sleeping. "You don't have to leave," she said. "James meant it about the job." Tommy shook his head. "This is your family's place. I don't belong here." He paused, studying her face in the moonlight. "But you do. I can see it in how they look at you, how they listen when you talk. You're not just their cook anymore." "Sometimes I forget that myself," Clara admitted. "Don't," Tommy said seriously. "I've been wandering for 2 years, looking for a place to belong. You found yours. Don't let nobody take it away from you." The next morning, Tommy left with a full belly, clean clothes, and wages in his pocket. But he also left something behind, a reminder to Clara of how precious and fragile her newfound happiness really was. She'd opened her heart to this family, but hearts that opened could also be broken. And somewhere deep inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that her past was like a storm cloud on the horizon, growing bigger and darker with each passing day. As she watched Tommy's figure disappear into the morning mist, Clara whispered a prayer to whatever powers might be listening. "Let this last," she pleaded. "Let me keep them and let them keep me." But even as she spoke the words, she felt the cold wind of change stirring the grass around her feet, and she knew that prayers didn't always get answered the way people wanted them to. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried by a rider whose horse foamed at the mouth from being pushed too hard. Clara recognized the fancy paper and perfect handwriting before she even opened it, and her hands started shaking so badly she nearly dropped the letter in the fire. Mrs. Victoria Pemberton had found her at last, and the words on the page hit like bullets fired from a rifle. Your lies have been discovered, Miss Whitfield. Return immediately to face justice for your crimes, or I will come to collect you myself. The theft of my family's silver will not go unpunished. You have 1 week. Clara sank into the nearest chair, the letter fluttering to the floor like a dying bird. In the parlor, she could hear Margaret teaching the twins their letters, their young voices reciting the alphabet in sing-song harmony. Benjamin was in the kitchen, standing on a stool to help with the bread dough, probably getting more flour on himself than in the bowl. James was in the barn with Daniel, showing him how to repair a broken harness. Normal family sounds from a normal family morning, and here she sat holding the paper that would destroy it all. Miss Clara? Benjamin appeared in the doorway, his face and hands white with flour. Are you sick? You look funny. Clara forced a smile and quickly picked up the letter, folding it small and tucking it into her apron pocket. Just a little tired, sweet boy. Did you finish helping with the bread? It's getting big and puffy, Benjamin said excitedly. Margaret says that means it's happy. Can bread be happy? I think anything can be happy if it's loved enough, Clara said, her voice catching slightly on the words. She pulled Benjamin onto her lap, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair and trying to memorize the weight of his small body against hers. Margaret appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. The bread's ready for the oven. Is everything all right? You've been staring out that window for 10 minutes. Clara realized she'd been holding Benjamin and gazing at the prairie without seeing it, her mind spinning with panic and desperate plans. How could she explain to this family that everything they believed about her was built on lies? That she wasn't Clara Whitfield, respectable cook, but Clara Whitfield, accused thief who'd fled in the night like a common criminal? Just thinking about winter preparations, Clara lied, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. We'll need to preserve more vegetables. Lay in extra firewood. But Margaret's eyes were too sharp, too knowing. The girl had been forced to grow up quickly after her mother's death, and she could read people's faces like books. Something's wrong, she said quietly. You can tell me. I'm good at keeping secrets. Before Clara could answer, the sound of hoofbeats filled the yard outside. Through the window, she saw James riding hard toward the house, his face grim with urgency. He swung down from his horse before it had fully stopped and took the porch steps 2 at a time. Clara, he called, bursting through the door. Sheriff Morrison's in town asking questions about you. Someone's been spreading stories about stolen silver and... He stopped when he saw her face. You already know. Clara nodded toward her apron pocket where the letter crinkled like accusation. She found me. Who found you? Margaret asked, her voice rising with alarm. What's happening? James looked from Clara to his daughter, understanding passing between them like lightning. Margaret was old enough to hear the truth, old enough to help protect the family from whatever storm was coming. But the twins and Benjamin were still young enough to believe in fairy tales where good people always won and families stayed together forever. Take Benjamin to the kitchen, James told Margaret gently. Start lunch. You're Clara and I need to talk. After the children left, Clara pulled out the letter with trembling fingers and handed it to James. She watched his face change as he read, saw the moment when he understood exactly how much trouble she was in. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and handed it back to her. Tell me what really happened, he said quietly. The words spilled out like water from a broken dam. Clara told him about her job as a governess in the Pemberton house, about the missing silver that had been found hidden in her room, about fleeing in the night with nothing but her savings and the clothes on her back. She told him about the lies in her letter, about the false references she'd provided, about the fact that she'd never actually been a professional cook before coming to his house. I never stole anything, she finished, her voice barely above a whisper. But who would believe the word of hired help against a family like the Pembertons? They have money and reputation and power. I have nothing. James was quiet for a long time, his calloused fingers drumming against the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and sure. You have us. You don't understand, Clara said desperately. If she comes here, if she tells people what she believes I did, it won't just ruin me. It'll ruin you too. No one will do business with a man who harbors a thief. Your children will be whispered about in town. Margaret will never find a husband. The boys will be shunned. I can't let that happen to them. And I can't let you face this alone, James said firmly. You're part of this family now, Clara. That means we stand together, no matter what comes. Through the kitchen doorway, Clara could see Benjamin's dark curls as he stood on his stool, carefully stirring something in a big bowl. Margaret moved around him with quiet efficiency, her movements graceful and sure. The twins chattered like birds, their voices bright with laughter. These children had become her world, and now she was going to lose them all because of something she'd never done. There has to be a way to fight this, James said, but Clara could hear the doubt in his voice. A woman's reputation, once destroyed, was nearly impossible to rebuild. And Mrs. Pemberton had the kind of money and influence that could crush a frontier family without even trying. Maybe I should just go, Clara whispered. Leave before she comes here. Disappear again. No. The word came out sharp and final. Running didn't solve anything the first time. It just delayed the problem. James reached across the table and took her hands in his work-rough ones. We'll find another way. There has to be evidence, witnesses, something that proves your innocence. But even as he spoke the words of hope, Clara could see the fear in his eyes. He was a good man trying to protect his family, but good men didn't always win against wealthy, powerful enemies. And sometimes love wasn't enough to overcome the cruel realities of the world. As if summoned by her thoughts, Benjamin came running into the room, his face bright with excitement. Miss Clara, come see. The bread looks just like a sleeping baby. Clara smiled and followed him to the kitchen, but her heart felt like lead in her chest. Each moment with these children might be one of her last, and she tried to memorize everything. The sound of their voices, the warmth of their hugs, the way they looked at her like she was the most important person in their world. Because soon, very soon, Mrs. Pemberton would come to take it all away. The town of Millbrook buzzed with whispers like angry bees in a disturbed hive. Clara felt eyes following her as she walked down Main Street toward the general store, and conversations stopped abruptly when she passed. Mrs. Henderson, the preacher's wife, actually crossed to the other side of the street to avoid greeting her. Even Mr. Thompson, who usually tipped his hat and asked about the children, suddenly found something fascinating to study in his shop window when she approached. Sheriff Morrison had been busy spreading Mrs. Pemberton's poison, it seemed. The story had grown in the telling, as stories always did. Clara was no longer just accused of stealing silver. Now she was a master criminal who had robbed multiple families across the country. Some folks claimed she'd murdered her previous employers and buried them in their own gardens. Others whispered that she was part of a gang of thieves who targeted wealthy homes by placing their members as servants. Ignore them, Margaret said fiercely, walking beside Clara with her chin raised high. The 16-year-old had insisted on coming to town despite Clara's protests, and now she faced down the staring townspeople like a young general defending her territory. They don't know you like we do. But Clara could see the doubt creeping into some faces, could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a heavy coat. Mrs. Pemberton had sent more than just a letter. She'd sent a hired investigator to spread her version of events to anyone who would listen. The man had rented a room at the boarding house and spent 3 days buying drinks for local men, filling their ears with tales of Clara's supposed crimes. Inside the general store, the conversation died the moment Clara stepped through the door. Mrs. Patterson, who usually chatted about her rheumatism and asked for Clara's recipe for pain-relieving tea, suddenly became very interested in sorting through bolts of fabric. The 3 farmers by the counter stopped their discussion of wheat prices and stared at her with suspicious eyes. "Afternoon, Miss Whitfield," said Mr. Jameson, the store owner, but his voice was cold and formal. No more friendly questions about the children or compliments on her excellent pies. "What can I do for you today?" Clara handed him her list, written in Margaret's careful handwriting. "Just our usual supplies, please." As Mr. Jameson gathered flour, sugar, and other necessities, Clara heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to her friend, I always thought there was something strange about her. Too pretty, too refined for a simple cook. Should have known she was hiding something. Margaret's face flushed red with anger, and she started to turn toward the gossiping women. Clara caught her arm gently. "Don't," she whispered. "It will only make things worse." But things were already worse. When Mr. Jameson tallied up their bill, the price was nearly double what it should have been. Clara stared at the numbers, her heart sinking. "I think there's been a mistake." "No mistake," he said curtly. "Prices have gone up. Supply and demand, you understand. Sometimes it costs more to serve certain customers." Clara understood perfectly. This was how a community drove out unwanted members. Not with violence or direct confrontation, but with 1,000 small cruelties that made life impossible. Higher prices, cold shoulders, whispered accusations. Soon, no one would do business with the McKenna family at all. She paid without argument, gathering the supplies with as much dignity as she could manage. But as they loaded their purchases into the wagon, Margaret's young voice shook with barely controlled fury. "This isn't fair," she said. "You've never hurt anyone. You've done nothing but help our family and everyone else in this town. Remember when you doctored Mrs. Cooper's baby through that fever? Or when you organized the food drive for the Wilson family after their barn burned? How can they forget all that?" "Fear makes people forget a lot of things," Clara said sadly. "When someone with money and power tells a story, people believe it because it's easier than thinking for themselves." The ride home was quiet except for the creak of wagon wheels and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. Clara felt like those hawks, trapped in an endless circle with no place to land safely. If she stayed, she would destroy the McKenna family's reputation and livelihood. If she left, she would break their hearts and abandon them to face whatever consequences Mrs. Pemberton might devise. At home, Daniel was waiting in the yard with news that made Clara's blood run cold. "Sheriff Morrison came by while you were gone," he said, his young face serious beyond his years. "He said that woman, Mrs. Pemberton, she's coming herself, should be here by the end of the week." Clara felt the last of her hope drain away like water from a broken bucket. Mrs. Pemberton wasn't content to destroy her from a distance. She wanted to finish the job in person. The woman who had wealth, social standing, and the power to ruin lives with a few well-placed words was coming to collect her pound of flesh. That evening, as Clara helped Benjamin with his bath, the little boy looked up at her with worried eyes. "Why is everyone being mean to you?" he asked. "Tommy said people sometimes don't like strangers, but you're not a stranger anymore. You're our Clara." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," she said carefully. "They believe things that aren't true, and they act badly because of it." "But you didn't do anything bad," Benjamin said with the absolute certainty of childhood. "You save people. You saved me when I got hurt. You saved Tommy when he was hungry. You saved all of us when we were sad." If only the rest of the world could see her through Benjamin's eyes, Clara thought. If only love and truth were stronger than money and lies. But she was learning that the world was a harder place than fairy tales suggested, and sometimes good people suffered while bad people prospered. Later that night, Clara sat on the porch steps looking up at the star-scattered sky, trying to find some answer written in the darkness. James found her there, his own face drawn with worry and sleepless nights. "I've been thinking," he said, settling beside her on the wooden steps. "Maybe we should get married." Clara's heart jumped, but before hope could take root, she saw the calculation in his eyes. This wasn't a proposal born of love, but of desperation. "A legal marriage would give you protection," he continued. "Mrs. Pemberton couldn't touch you as easily if you were my wife. The children need you, Clara. I need you." The words should have made her happy, but instead they filled her with sadness. She had dreamed of marriage, of belonging fully to this family she loved. But not like this, not as a shield against her enemies or a solution to a problem. "That's not fair to you," she said quietly. "Or to the children. Marriage should be about love, not legal protection." "Who says it's not about love?" James asked, and when Clara looked at him, She saw something deeper than desperation in his eyes. "Do you think I could have watched you care for my children, seen you bring life back to this house, and not fallen in love with you?" Before Clara could answer, a sound from the distance made them both freeze. Hoofbeats, coming fast through the night. Someone was riding hard toward their house, and Clara knew with cold certainty that her time had run out. Mrs. Pemberton had arrived early, and the final battle for Clara's life and future was about to begin. The rider who thundered into their yard wasn't Mrs. Pemberton at all, but Tommy Walker, the hungry young man they'd helped weeks earlier. His horse was lathered with sweat and breathing hard, and Tommy himself looked like he'd seen a ghost. He slid from the saddle before the animal had fully stopped, his face wild with urgency and something that looked like fear. "Miss Clara," he shouted, stumbling toward the porch. "Thank God you're still here. You got to listen to me. That woman who's been asking about you. I seen her in Kansas City, and she ain't alone." James stood up slowly, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he kept by the door. "What woman? What are you talking about?" "Mrs. Pemberton," Tommy gasped, still catching his breath from his hard ride. "The one who says Miss Clara stole from her. I was in a saloon 3 days back, trying to earn money for food, when I heard this fancy lady talking to some rough men. She was showing them a picture of Miss Clara and offering money, a lot of money, for someone to bring her back to St. Louis." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "What kind of men?" "The kind who don't ask questions about what's legal and what ain't," Tommy said grimly. "Bounty hunters, maybe worse. She told them you were a dangerous criminal who'd escaped justice, and that any means necessary were acceptable to capture you." The words hit Clara like physical blows. Mrs. Pemberton wasn't content with just ruining her reputation. She wanted her dragged back to St. Louis in chains, probably to face trumped-up charges in a rigged court. A woman with enough money could buy any kind of justice she wanted, especially against someone with no family, no connections, no power to fight back. "How far behind you are they?" James asked, already calculating distances and timing in his head. "Maybe a day, maybe less. I rode straight through, changing horses when mine got tired. But they're coming, and they're armed." Tommy grabbed Clara's hands, his young face earnest with desperation. "You saved my life, Miss Clara. Now let me save yours. I know places to hide, people who won't ask questions. We can disappear where they'll never find us." For a moment, Clara was tempted. The idea of running away with Tommy, of disappearing into the vast wilderness of the frontier, seemed like the only escape from the trap closing around her. But then she thought of Benjamin's sleepy smile, of Margaret's fierce loyalty, of the family that had become her whole world. "I can't leave them," she said quietly. "Whatever happens, I can't abandon these children." "Then they'll take you back to St. Louis," Tommy said desperately. "And you know what happens to people like us when the rich folks want revenge. They don't care about truth or justice. They just want someone to pay." James stepped between them, his face set with determination. "Nobody's taking anybody anywhere. This is my land, my family, and I'll defend both with my life if necessary." "You don't understand," Tommy said, shaking his head. "These men aren't just going to knock on your door and ask politely. They'll burn your house down if they have to, hurt your children to make you cooperate. I've seen what they do." From inside the house came the sound of footsteps, and Margaret appeared in the doorway with the twins close behind her. They'd obviously been listening to everything, their young faces pale with fear and confusion. "What's happening?" Lucy asked, her voice small and scared. "Why does someone want to hurt Miss Clara?" Before anyone could answer, little Benjamin burst through the door in his nightgown, his dark hair tousled from sleep. He ran straight to Clara and wrapped his arms around her legs, looking up at her with absolute trust. "Are you going away?" he asked, and Clara's heart broke at the worry in his voice. Clara knelt down and pulled him into her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair while her mind raced with impossible choices. Stay and risk bringing violence to this family she loved. Run and abandon them to face Mrs. Pemberton's wrath alone. Fight and probably lose everything anyway. "Listen to me, all of you," she said, looking at each of the children in turn. I need you to understand something very important. There are people who believe I did something wrong, something I never actually did. They're coming here to take me away, and I won't let any of you get hurt because of me. We won't let them take you, Margaret said fiercely, moving to stand beside her father. This is our family. We protect each other. She's right, Daniel said, appearing from the barn where he'd been tending the horses. At 13, he was already tall and strong, with his father's steady courage shining in his young eyes. Whatever you did or didn't do, you're one of us now. That means something. Clara looked around at these children who were willing to fight for her, at James whose love had given her a reason to hope, at Tommy whose loyalty had brought him riding through the night to warn her. She thought about all the ways her life had changed since coming to this place, how she'd gone from a desperate woman with nothing to lose to someone with everything worth protecting. There might be another way, she said slowly, an idea beginning to form in her mind. Mrs. Pemberton wants me because she believes I'm guilty. But what if we could prove I'm innocent? How? James asked. It's your word against hers, and she has all the money and power. Clara stood up, settling Benjamin on her hip while her thoughts raced. Tommy, when you heard her talking to those men, did she say anything about the actual theft? Any details about what was stolen or how it was found? Tommy's brow furrowed as he thought back. She kept talking about a silver locket, how it was a family heirloom that had been in her family for generations. Said finding it in your room proved you were guilty beyond doubt. Something cold and sharp settled in Clara's stomach. A silver locket? Are you sure? Positive. She even showed them a picture of it, heart-shaped thing with fancy engravings. Clara's mind reeled. She remembered the locket, remembered finding it hidden in her room where someone else had placed it. But she also remembered something else, something that might be the key to proving her innocence at last. James, she said urgently, do you still have your wife's jewelry box? The one with her personal things? James nodded, confusion clear on his face. Of course, it's in our bedroom. Why? Because, Clara said, her heart beginning to race with possibility. I think your wife might be the key to saving us all. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the prairie, growing closer with each passing moment. Time was running out, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Clara felt a spark of hope flickering in the darkness. The truth was hidden somewhere in this house, and if she could find it before Mrs. Pemberton's hired men arrived, she might just save not only herself, but the family she'd grown to love more than life itself. Clara's hands shook as she opened the delicate wooden jewelry box that had belonged to James's first wife, Sarah. The hinges creaked softly, releasing the faint scent of lavender and old memories. Inside, nestled among simple gold rings and pearl earrings, lay a silver locket that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. It was identical to the one Mrs. Pemberton claimed had been stolen, heart-shaped with intricate engravings of roses and vines. My God! James whispered, staring at the locket. Where did Sarah get this? Clara lifted the piece carefully, her heart hammering against her ribs. Look at the back, she said, turning it over. There, engraved in flowing script, were the initials SM, Sarah McKenna. James, this locket wasn't stolen from Mrs. Pemberton. It was made as part of a matching set. Margaret crowded closer, her eyes wide with understanding. You mean there were two of them? Exactly the same. Jewelers often made matching pieces for wealthy families, Clara explained, her voice growing stronger with each word. One for the mother, one for the daughter, or sometimes as gifts for sisters. Mrs. Pemberton has one half of the set, and your mother had the other. Tommy, who had been keeping watch at the window, suddenly straightened. They're coming, he said quietly. 3 riders, maybe 4. Still about a mile out, but moving fast. James moved to the window and peered out at the approaching dust cloud. Clara's right about the locket, but will anyone believe us? Mrs. Pemberton could claim we're lying, that this one was stolen too. Clara's mind raced as she studied the locket more closely. Then she noticed something that made her heart leap with hope. Look at this, she said, pointing to a tiny maker's mark on the back near the clasp. Every jeweler has their own mark. If this locket was made by the same craftsman as Mrs. Pemberton's, but at a different time, the town jeweler would have records, Margaret finished, her face bright with sudden understanding. Mr. Patterson keeps detailed books about every piece he's ever made or sold. But there's no time to get to town, Daniel said, checking the rifle his father had handed him. Those men will be here any minute. Clara looked around at the family that had become her whole world, at James's determined face, at Margaret's fierce courage, at the twins huddled together but still brave, at Benjamin clinging to her skirts with absolute trust. These people were willing to fight for her, to risk everything they had because they believed in her innocence and loved her enough to stand against the storm. Then we make our stand here, she said firmly. Together. The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and through the window they could see 4 riders approaching the house. Mrs. Pemberton rode in the center like a general leading her army, her black dress and severe expression making her look like a judge come to deliver sentence. The 3 men with her were exactly what Tommy had described, hard-faced bounty hunters with guns on their hips and no conscience in their eyes. James McKenna, Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried across the yard like a whip crack. I know you're harboring a criminal. Send out the woman who calls herself Clara Whitfield, and no one need be harmed. James stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. This is private property, ma'am. You and your men need to move along. I am Mrs. Victoria Pemberton of St. Louis, the woman announced, as if her name alone should make everyone bow down. The woman in your house is a thief who stole precious family heirlooms from my home. I have legal authority to retrieve my property and see that justice is done. Funny thing about that, Clara said, stepping out beside James with the locket held high for everyone to see. I think there's been a terrible mistake about who owns what. Mrs. Pemberton's face went white when she saw the locket, her composure cracking for the first time. That's impossible, she stammered. That locket is mine. It was stolen from my jewelry box. This locket belonged to my late wife, James said firmly. It's been in this house for years, long before Miss Whitfield ever came here. If you have one just like it, then perhaps you should be asking yourself how that came to be. One of the bounty hunters, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, shifted impatiently in his saddle. Enough talk. We came to collect the woman, and that's what we're gonna do. But Mrs. Pemberton held up a hand to stop him, her calculating mind clearly working through this new information. Clara could see the moment when doubt began to creep in, when the older woman started questioning the story she'd been told by her trusted servant. Where did you get that locket? Mrs. Pemberton demanded, her voice no longer quite so certain. It was a wedding gift from her grandmother, James replied. Made by a jeweler in Independence, Missouri, in 1862. We have the receipt. This was a lie. They had no such receipt, but Mrs. Pemberton didn't know that. Clara watched the woman's face carefully, looking for any sign that the truth was beginning to break through the wall of certainty that had driven her all this way. My locket was made by Cartwright and Sons in St. Louis, Mrs. Pemberton said slowly. In 1863. It was a gift for my daughter's 16th birthday. Then we have a matching set, Clara said gently, made by craftsmen who were probably trained by the same master jeweler. It happens more often than people think. For a long moment, silence stretched across the yard like a held breath. Mrs. Pemberton stared at the locket in Clara's hands, and Clara could see the woman's world rearranging itself around this new possibility. If Clara was telling the truth about the locket, then what else might she be telling the truth about? This proves nothing, one of the bounty hunters growled. Could be stolen goods, could be a fake. We got our orders and our money. But Mrs. Pemberton was no longer listening to her hired men. She was thinking about her trusted housekeeper, about the woman who had been so eager to point out Clara's supposed crimes, about the convenient timing of the evidence that had seemed so damning at the time. Tell me exactly what happened that night, she said to Clara, her voice quiet but carrying clearly across the distance between them. Tell me everything. Clara took a deep breath and began to speak, telling the story of that terrible night when her world had fallen apart. She spoke of Martha, the head housekeeper who had always resented her position with the children. She told of finding the locket hidden in her room, of the accusation that had come so quickly afterward, of fleeing in the night because she knew no one would believe the word of a servant against a family of standing. As she spoke, Clara watched Mrs. Pemberton's face change, saw the moment when the older woman finally began to see the truth that had been hidden from her. The woman who had trusted her household to Martha, who had believed every word of her servant's poison, was finally beginning to understand how completely she had been manipulated. And in that moment of recognition, Clara knew that the tide of battle was finally beginning to turn. Mrs. Pemberton's hands trembled as she dismounted from her horse, her face pale as winter snow. The bounty hunters shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly uncomfortable with this turn of events that didn't match their simple instructions to grab a woman and collect their money. The scarred leader spat into the dust and growled, "Ma'am, we didn't ride all this way to listen to fairy tales. We got business to finish." "Wait," Mrs. Pemberton said sharply, raising her hand to stop them. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed, but Clara could hear uncertainty creeping in like cracks in ice. "Miss Whitfield, you mentioned my housekeeper Martha. Tell me exactly what she said to you that night." Clara's heart pounded as she remembered that terrible evening. "She came to my room after the children were asleep, said you'd discovered something missing and wanted to search the servants' quarters. When we found the locket in my dresser drawer, she acted shocked, but—" Clara paused, forcing herself to recall details she'd tried to forget. She knew exactly where to look. She went straight to that drawer like she'd put it there herself. "That's a lie." The scarred bounty hunter's hand moved toward his gun. "You're just trying to talk your way out of trouble." But Mrs. Pemberton ignored him, her sharp mind working through memories with new understanding. "Martha did suggest searching your room first. She said you'd been acting strangely, spending too much time with my jewelry box when you cleaned my bedroom." The older woman's voice grew quieter. "I thought she was being helpful, protective of the family." James stepped closer to the edge of the porch, his rifle still ready but his voice calm. "Ma'am, maybe we should continue this conversation inside, away from these men you hired. This seems like a family matter now." The lead bounty hunter laughed harshly. "Nice try, farmer. We got a contract and we're keeping it." He started to dismount, his hand on his gun belt. "Hand over the woman, or we'll take her ourselves." That's when Tommy stepped out from behind the house, moving with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned to survive on the frontier. In his hands was James's shotgun, and his young face was set with grim determination. "I don't think so, mister." The bounty hunters spun toward this new threat, but they'd made a mistake by focusing on the front of the house. Daniel appeared at the corner of the barn, carrying another rifle. Margaret stepped onto the porch beside her father, a pistol steady in her hands. Even the twins had positioned themselves at windows, ready to help defend their family. "Seems like you're outnumbered," James said mildly. "And this is still my property. I suggest you ride away before someone gets hurt." The scarred leader's face twisted with anger. "You people don't understand who you're dealing with. We got legal papers." "From who?" Mrs. Pemberton interrupted, her voice cutting through his bluster. "I hired you to retrieve stolen property, but if that property was never stolen—" She looked at Clara with something that might have been the beginning of remorse. "Tell me about Martha's behavior in the weeks before the incident. Was there anything unusual?" Clara thought back to those final days in the Pemberton house, memories she'd buried under months of fear and shame. She'd been asking strange questions about my background, about my family. She seemed angry that your children preferred me to her for bedtime stories and comfort when they were hurt. And she'd been going through my things. I found my letters moved, my clothes searched. She was jealous?" Mrs. Pemberton said slowly, the pieces falling into place like a puzzle solving itself. "Martha had been with our family for 15 years. She saw herself as irreplaceable. But then you came and the children adored you." The older woman's face crumpled with the weight of her realization. "Dear God, what have I done?" The lead bounty hunter had heard enough. "I don't care about your family drama. We came for the thief, and we're leaving with her." He drew his gun with practiced speed, but Tommy was faster. The shotgun blast echoed across the prairie like thunder, and the man's weapon flew from his hand as buckshot peppered the ground at his feet. The other two bounty hunters reached for their guns, but found themselves facing 5 armed defenders who clearly knew how to use their weapons. "Next shot won't be a warning," Tommy said quietly, reloading with smooth efficiency. "I suggest you think real careful about your next move." For a moment, violence hung in the air like summer lightning, ready to strike. Clara could see the calculations in the bounty hunter's eyes, 3 against 5, and they'd lost the element of surprise. Their leader nursed his stinging hand and glared at Tommy with pure hatred. "This ain't over," he snarled. "We got a contract, and Pemberton money spends just fine." "The contract is void," Mrs. Pemberton said firmly, surprising everyone including herself. "I'm calling off this vigilante justice. Miss Whitfield, I owe you an apology that I can never adequately express." But the bounty hunters weren't ready to give up their payday so easily. The scarred leader signaled to his companions with a slight nod, and Clara saw them spreading out to flank the house. These were men who lived by violence, and they weren't going to let words and apologies cost them their fee. "Look out!" Margaret shouted as one of the men spurred his horse toward the side of the house. What followed was a brief but fierce battle that would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. The McKenna family fought like wildcats defending their den, each person knowing exactly what they were protecting. Tommy's military training served him well as he coordinated their defense, while James's steady courage anchored them all. When the dust settled, one bounty hunter lay groaning in the dirt with a wounded shoulder. Another had fled on foot into the prairie, and their leader sat on his horse with his hands raised, surrounded by 5 very determined people with guns pointed at his chest. "Now," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice shaking with reaction and regret, "I believe we have some serious talking to do." The parlor of the McKenna house had never hosted such an unlikely gathering. Mrs. Pemberton sat stiffly in the best chair, her traveling dress wrinkled and her perfect composure finally cracked. Clara perched on the edge of the sofa, still hardly believing that the nightmare that had driven her across half the country was finally ending. The children clustered around their father and Clara like chicks seeking shelter, while Tommy kept watch at the window in case the escaped bounty hunter decided to return with reinforcements. "I need to understand everything," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every detail about Martha's behavior, about that night, about what really happened in my house." For the next hour, Clara told her story completely for the first time. She spoke of Martha's growing resentment, of the way the housekeeper had poisoned the other servants against her, of the small cruelties and deliberate sabotages that had made her final weeks in the house miserable. She described finding her personal letters read and her belongings searched, of Martha's questions about her past and family connections. "She was looking for ammunition to use against me," Clara realized as she spoke. "When she couldn't find any real scandal, she created one." Mrs. Pemberton listened with growing horror, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. 15 years, she whispered. "I trusted that woman for 15 years. She helped raise my children, managed my household, knew all our secrets." The older woman's voice broke. "And she used that trust to destroy an innocent girl's life because of petty jealousy." Margaret, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. "Mrs. Pemberton, do you remember when Miss Clara first came to work for you? Did Martha recommend her?" The question struck like lightning. Mrs. Pemberton's eyes widened as memory flooded back. "No," she said slowly. "Martha was against hiring Clara from the beginning. She said we didn't need another governess, that she could handle the children's education herself. But my husband insisted." She stopped, understanding dawning in her face. Martha knew from the start that Clara would be everything she wasn't: young, educated, beloved by the children. "So she planned to get rid of her from day one," James said grimly. "The theft was just the method she chose." Outside, Sheriff Morrison's voice called from the yard. "Hello, the house. Everything all right in there?" Tommy tensed at the window, but Clara recognized the sheriff's voice. "It's okay," she told him. "He's a good man." James went to invite the sheriff inside, and soon the lawman was listening to the whole incredible story with growing amazement. Sheriff Morrison had known the McKenna family for years, and his presence seemed to give Mrs. Pemberton the final push she needed to face the full truth of what had happened. "Sheriff," she said formally, "I want to make a full confession of my mistakes and clear Miss Whitfield's name completely. I was deceived by a trusted servant into believing false accusations, and I pursued an innocent woman across state lines based on lies." The sheriff nodded slowly. "That's mighty big of you, ma'am. But what about that other fellow, the one who got away? He might still cause trouble." "I'll make sure there's no bounty on Miss Whitfield's head," Mrs. Pemberton said firmly. "I'll write letters to every sheriff and marshal between here and St. Louis, explaining the truth. And I'll deal with Martha personally when I return home." Clara felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she'd carried for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. "What will happen to her?" she asked. "Martha will be dismissed without references and reported to the authorities for theft and false accusation," Mrs. Pemberton said, her voice hard as winter stone. "If she's lucky, she'll avoid prison. If she's smart, she'll disappear before I get home." But even as relief flooded through Clara, she found herself thinking about the woman who had caused so much pain. "She must have been desperately unhappy to do such a thing," Clara said quietly. "Jealousy that's strong comes from feeling worthless." Mrs. Pemberton stared at her in amazement. "You're defending the woman who tried to destroy you?" "I'm not defending what she did," Clara clarified. "But I understand what it feels like to be afraid of losing everything you think defines you. Fear makes people do terrible things." The conversation that followed was awkward and halting, filled with apologies that could never fully heal the wounds that had been inflicted. Mrs. Pemberton offered money, letters of reference, anything she could think of to make amends for the injustice she had unknowingly perpetrated. "There is one thing," Clara said finally. "Write to the families in St. Louis who might have heard Martha's version of events. Make sure they know the truth. I may never go back there, but other innocent people shouldn't suffer because of lies." As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Pemberton prepared to leave, her mission transformed from capturing a criminal to making what amends she could for a terrible mistake. Before she climbed into her carriage for the long journey home, she approached Clara one final time. "I hope someday you can forgive a foolish old woman who let pride and prejudice cloud her judgment," she said, tears bright in her eyes. "I already have," Clara replied, and meant it. Carrying anger would only poison my happiness here. As the carriage disappeared into the distance, Clara found herself surrounded by the McKenna family, her family now, in every way that mattered. Benjamin climbed into her lap, Margaret hugged her fiercely, and the twins chattered excitedly about the adventure they just lived through. But it was James who spoke the words that mattered most. "Clara Whitfield," he said formally, dropping to one knee in front of the whole family, "will you marry me? Not because you need protection, not because it's practical, but because I love you and want to spend the rest of my life with the woman who saved us all." Through her tears of joy, Clara could only whisper one word: "Yes." The wedding took place a month later in the Millbrook Church, with the whole town in attendance. The people who had whispered and turned away were there to celebrate, their shame at doubting her evident in their enthusiastic applause. Tommy served as James's best man, having decided to stay on as a permanent ranch hand. Margaret was Clara's maid of honor, radiant with happiness for the woman who had become her second mother. And as Clara spoke her vows, surrounded by love and acceptance, she knew that she had finally found what she'd been searching for her whole life. Not just a place to belong, but a family that had chosen her as surely as she had chosen them. The past was truly behind her now, and the future stretched ahead bright with promise and love.